For Trichomes.com, I'm Jesse Batend, and this is The High Ground. On this show, we feature leaders of the cannabis industry. We talk to everyone from farmers to CEOs and public officials, anyone making an impact on the cannabis community and beyond. The basic version of Dr. Rob's story is one that you might have heard before. Rob Flannery, like a lot of other people, got into the business that he's into in some ways because he wanted to help a family member. In this case, Rob's mom, who was diagnosed with cancer and was absolutely not a cannabis user. But I'll let Rob tell his own story. Dr. Rob Flannery is the CEO and founder of Dr. Rob's Farms. Unlike a lot of the people who get into this because they want to help a family member, Rob's background isn't in medicine. He's actually a plant biologist. So I decided to call him up to find out more about what we can learn about the plant itself, what we still need to know, and a recent opportunity where he got to talk to one of my own personal early sources of information about cannabis, for better and worse. Let me just start by saying, Dr. Rob, I already said it before, but thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
It's my sincere pleasure, and the feeling's absolutely mutual.
Do you mind if we kind of tell the listeners where you're at, where you're kind of set up? This is a first for me on the podcast.
Yeah, I due to, as we record this right now, we're in December of 2020 and, full on pandemic. And I happen to live about 7 hours away from one of our principal grow sites. And so normally I would be flying down to oversee operations and production. But, I'm a man of science, and I tend to listen to experts when there's an expert in the field that says, hey, being indoors, even with masks, might be a bit of a risk. I made the decision that I would be driving down. And so I actually see fewer people and come into contact with fewer people than, like when my daughter goes to a dance class or something, even though she's wearing masks and everything. But it's just a personal decision. So I pulled off to the side of the road. And I am currently using my phone as a hotspot and my laptop to record. So if you do hear a little bit of noise in the background, I do apologize in advance, but maybe a honking here and there. But I'm about halfway to my operations, and but I wanted to safely record this with you, and so here I am on the side of the road talking.
First question that I kind of want to ask you, kind of an unconventional one. The other thing that you told me right before we got started is that this is actually one of your favorite things to do, is to talk about cannabis and educate people about it. Mm-hmm. When you are talking to somebody who, doesn't know anything about you, maybe doesn't know all that much about cannabis at all, where do you like to start? Do you start with your personal story? How do you kind of reach people for the first time?
That's honestly a great question. I think a lot of it has to do with, the way I like to start is I don't really introduce who I am or the fact that I've got 3 letters behind my name or anything like that. But I tend to talk a little bit differently than most cannabis cultivators. But it's just, and I'm not saying anything fundamentally different than most cannabis cultivators. I just do it with a little bit more technical nomenclature. So the terms I use tend to be a little bit nerdier, and that's just a function of my postgraduate degree. But I'm not really saying anything fundamentally different. I think that's what people first triggers them, is that, hey, this person is saying things a little bit differently than a lot of cultivators. And also a big part of it too is I don't look the part. If you see a picture of me, I do not look like a PhD. A lot of people, I think, kind of have an understanding of what PhDs look like from shows like Big Bang Theory. And, I don't look like Dr. Sheldon Cooper or anyone else like that. I'm actually a former All-American college football player.
I was going to say.
And so, although I'm not as big as I was back in my playing days, I'm still a pretty big dude. And I definitely look more of the jock than I do the academic. And so, kind of, I like to play into that a little bit and allow people to have some assumptions of my mental capabilities. And oftentimes they may be right, but every once in a while I get the trick of thinking that there's more to a jock than just playing football and bashing your head and against someone else's helmet. There's actually a little bit of thought process that goes behind the Scholar Athlete.
Now, I feel like there's like a seal joke in here somewhere, but your PhD is actually in plant biology, and you studied roses. Is that correct?
That is correct. So, 1 second, I have to do the whole spiel and say what my PhD is in. So I have a
Okay, yeah, yeah.
yeah, I have a PhD in plant biology with an emphasis in environmental horticulture and a specific expertise in hydroponic crop optimization for cut flower production and controlled environment agriculture from UC Davis. And very proud to say the University of California, Davis was recently voted by U.S. News and World Report as the #1 plant science school on the planet and #2 for ag science. So I,
Hmm.
technically trained by the top university on the planet to grow cannabis, essentially, because cannabis is nothing more than cut flower production. So yeah, I'm definitely nerdy and have a lot of connections with other nerds that we like to talk about. And cannabis is a pretty unique crop when it comes to research, just because there's not a lot of research around it. We have a lot of medical research, and there's always needs to be more. But when it comes to cannabis cultivation, we have very few universities and researchers that are really exploring, cannabis cultivation research, and so it's really like virgin territory getting involved with it. And yes, I absolutely
Yeah.
did study chrysanthemums and roses during my PhD work, and my girlfriend at the time, now wife, definitely appreciated the constant influx of roses into the household. However, I will fully admit that she did get jaded towards the end. Getting roses all the time. I worked on two different types of roses. One's called the cardinal rose, which is the deep red rose that we all know and love that you get on Valentine's Day and Mother's Day and things like that. But I also worked on a rose called the fire and ice rose, which is a red and white one. And one time I brought in a dozen fire and ice roses, and I overheard my wife, who didn't think she could hear me when she's talking to her mom's, like, yeah, they're just the fire and ice, though, not the cardinal ones that I like.
These are a very common variety, so
Yeah,
it's really
exactly.
nothing big.
So, but I worked on chrysanthemums as well, and cannabis actually grows relatively similarly to chrysanthemums. So there's a lot of crossover there. But ultimately, cannabis is just another plant. I could be studying cotton, or I could be studying and researching, roses, but or any other cut flower, Gerber daisy, something like that. But cannabis is truly unique, just because there's a significant lack in that research around it, and there's so many answers, or I'm sorry, so many questions that we need to answer. Yeah.
And so there's a lot in there that I want to know more about, but in sort of broad terms, can you say a little bit more about the similarities between chrysanthemums and cannabis? Like, in what ways are they similar?
So I'd say the biggest one for me is the production style. So they're both long night plants, and what that means is they're photoperiodic plants. And what it means to be a photoperiodic plant is to the length of uninterrupted darkness, not actually day length, but actually interrupted darkness, is what dictates when the plant will flower. And so poinsettia is also another crop that does this. Mums are very much like this. Now, mums like it a little bit cooler than cannabis, but other than that, there are a lot of similarities. They're very highlight plants, and these are, mums can be potted plants. They can be sold as potted plants, but oftentimes they're sold as cut flower. But cannabis is essentially a cut flower crop, and it has a lot of similarities that the physiology that dictates how the plant grows is conserved along against many different types of plants, chrysanthemum being one of them.
That's really interesting. I this might be jumping ahead. I mean, it is jumping ahead a little bit, and I want to hear how you transitioned your study and knowledge into cannabis specifically. But I heard you tell a story once about when you were working, I believe, at a company called Spark or something like that, and you kind of witnessed this customer with a speech impediment. I want to make sure I ask you about that. Do you mind kind of telling that story, and we can kind of dovetail into how you got there?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I'm the former production director at Spark in San Francisco, which at least the time I was there was the largest vertically integrated dispensary in the state of California. company's founded by a gentleman by the name of Eric Pearson, just an absolute uh, pioneer in the space. I like to say that we are standing on the shoulders of giants, and he is one of those giants, in my opinion. But yeah, so the what you're referencing is, at the time I was working at Spark, there was no adult use or recreational cannabis consumption in the state of California. It was only medical. And so anyone who would come in to the dispensary are patients. And so we had one patient, there's a gentleman who had a form of autism that manifested in his inability to speak. However, he's very high functioning. He was extraordinarily good with math as well. And so he would do work for like NASA Goddard, contract work for NASA Goddard and for Apple, for Google, a lot of the big tech in the Bay Area, Sparks in San Francisco. So we'd oftentimes, have tech workers come through there. And this particular individual could not speak. However, everyone knew who he was, and that we all knew what he preferred to consume. He preferred Cannatonic, which is a cultivar of cannabis. One thing, real quick, you'll notice I said cultivar, which is short for cultivated variety, and not strain. Strain is actually the incorrect term. It's cultivar. Strain is what we use for viruses, fungi, and bacteria. For plants, we use varieties, or if it's a cultivated variety, we call it cultivar. But anyway, so Cannatonic is his preferred cultivar, and this is a high CBD cultivar. So he would go up to the counter, buy his flower, and in Spark in San Francisco, they have Volcano vaporizers right there for you to use. And so he would be in there, and if I was in there, I saw him, I'd go reserve a Volcano for him to sit there, and he'd come by. We wouldn't say anything to each other. He'd grind his flower, he'd prep it. He would, heat it up, fill up the bag for the Volcano, and he would inhale the vapor. And around 60 seconds, 90 seconds later, he just starts talking. And it just
Wow.
blows your mind to see that,
Yeah.
I think a lot of people who have been, who've bought into that propaganda that cannabis is, the devil's lettuce, the jazz cabbage, we've all been told it is, and whatever. If they witness this individual is a very high functioning individual, looks very straight laced, looks like a business person, who can't speak, and within 60 to 90 seconds of taking one hit, they just start talking with no speech impediment. It is truly life changing to witness that, and that was one of the big things for me. I played football in college, and NC2A sees THC as a banned substance, so I never consumed it, and I was always under the assumption or under the lie that cannabis made you stupid, which is why when I got into grad school, I never tried it. But it wasn't until I had to have back surgery due to my playing days of football that I realized, hey, the neuropathy that I'm feeling, the opiates that the doctors just gave me, they weren't really doing much. But cannabis helped me tremendously. And that was a big turning point for me as well. But, it's everyone has those transitional stories or transformational stories about cannabis and how it affected either themselves or a loved one or something like that. And you just see these things, what this plant can do. It is very fascinating. It changes a lot of people's ideas of what cannabis is very, very quickly.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. And that's really interesting what you were just saying, because I've talked to a couple of people who have played football at one point or another and are now in cannabis, and I've not yet heard someone say kind of where I'd love to just ask you a little bit more about that, because
Mm-hmm.
part of the culture with football, I mean, even before a professional level, is that it's this sort of play through the pain
Yeah.
mentality, and players are in some cases introduced to opiates, in some cases sort of famously, at pretty young ages, where
Mm-hmm.
cannabis is just not something. Do you see a day where professional athletes will be using, whether it's CBD or THC, at potentially as part of a pain management routine that replaces opiates?
I absolutely do, and I think I'll speak to football just because football is so
I
near and
mean,
dear to my
yeah.
heart. I think like the NFL and college football and football in general is an inherently dangerous sport. There's no,
Hmm.
the data is there. It is very dangerous to bang your head up against someone time and time again. CTE is a significant problem that the NFL has to deal with, and I think their biggest PR problem, is
Right,
dealing
right.
with CTE and a lot of these players after they're done playing. The concussions that they receive, and I think there's going to be a time. We just saw that the NBA said that next year they are not going to be testing for cannabis. They will not, even though it's going to be remaining a substance that is not allowed in the NBA. They have now admitted that they will no longer be testing. I think that's the first baby step, right? And I think the NFL is
Sure.
going to do that as well. And I think part of the reason why that is because there is a lot of evidence to suggest that consuming cannabinoids, specifically CBD, and THCA, and a lot of the other cannabinoids and terpenes are very strong anti-inflammatories. And THCA, for example, is 20 times anti-inflammatory as aspirin, and it's 2 times anti-inflammatory as hydrocortisone. So it's
Mm,
it's
that's amazing.
these are powerful medicines, and inflammation from injury and helping to recover from those injuries is going to be a big part of keeping an athlete at the top of their game. My wife's a huge San Francisco 49ers fan, and not just because she is a fan of the way Jimmy G looks like off the field and with the uniform on. She has a type, let's just say. We met when I was playing football, and she definitely likes a football player look. But she's always been a 49ers fan. The 49ers have been demolished this season just from injuries. And, recovering
Mhm.
and getting back into the game is going to be a big part of not just the good PR, making people feel good about, treating the players well, but also it's going to be a monetary decision. Like, oh, if I have a star running back who has a sprained ankle, you got a bum wheel with the sprained ankle, and it sounds like, oh, I just got a sprained ankle, play through that. Oftentimes, if you're not the top of your game, you might as well put in your second string player. And so getting the first team back on the field faster than usual, I think is going to be a business decision for a lot of the NFL team owners. But ultimately, you know, I foresee a time when if someone gets a concussion or if you have a big hit, you come off the field and you're getting a gas mask full of a volatile CBD vapor that you inhale
Wow.
real quick. I definitely foresee that happening, and I
Wow.
look forward to that because I think the NFL, the players are seen as a commodity by a lot of the owners, and taking care of those players is something that I'm always pushing for. And I think this is a big part of that whole package, in my opinion.
So this is a very broad question, and keeping it just to the NFL, whether it's the NFL, whether it's the Biden administration, whether it's anybody who's kind of in this place of, yeah, there's some promising stuff about this cannabis, but I want to study it more.
Mhm.
Um, it does sound like in a lot of cases, business, financial opportunities are what sometimes move the ball. But what do you think people need to see? Because I mean, I imagine in this case, not having your players run the risk of addiction, and like you said, like there's a lot of upside in at least trying these things.
Mhm.
Um, what do you think people need to see in order to come around to the possibility? And is it just federal legalization that's holding people back?
Well, I think the propaganda we've been fed for such a long time that
Mhm.
the Onion always satirizes our political situation. I always thought it was funny, like when Jeff Sessions was removed from the Trump administration. The Onion ran an article talking about how Jeff Sessions is so depressed he's going to take one puff off of a joint to commit suicide, and it's one of those things where I think there are a lot of people who think, yeah, like this is a dangerous plant, and
Right.
it really is a benign plant. There's the one thing I always like to mention is there's this term called LD50. And LD50 is what scientists and researchers use to determine what the acute toxicity of a substance is. So LD stands for lethal dose, and 50 is in reference to where 50% of a sample population were to die from that lethal dose. And so,
Hmm.
this is researchers and scientists will say, okay, well, the LD50 of something that's very, very toxic is going to be low because it doesn't really take much of a dose to cause a lethal dose. So we
Right.
know what the LD50 is for like things that are very poisonous: arsenic, strychnine, cyanide. We know what the LD50 is for things like salt and sugar and water. You can overdose by drinking too much water. You can die from drinking too much water. We do not know what the LD50 is for cannabis because we've never gotten to that point. And I've heard some people who've estimated that for the average person, the LD50 of cannabis is around 150,000 grams. Well, 150,000 grams is more than my body weight, and I'm a pretty big dude. So,
Yeah, that's like literally like a field, right?
yeah,
That's like a quarter. That's like your backyard full of plants.
exactly right. And so, like, first of all, congratulations to whoever consumed 150,000 grams of cannabis. That's quite a feat. But you're never going to get to the point where we're going to have an acute toxicity in cannabis. You're never going to overdose. You know, the CB1 and CB2 receptors that the cannabinoids bind to, primarily bind to. There are a lot of other things that the cannabinoids and terpenes have an effect on us, but the CB1 and CB2 receptors that the cannabinoids bind to are not found in the part of the brainstem that control heart rate or breathing. And so, you can overdose with opiates because you stop breathing. It affects your ability, your body's ability to control your breath rate, breathing rate. And so that doesn't happen with cannabis. And so you're not going to have an overdose where you just stop breathing. I think worst case scenario, you're going to go to Taco Bell and buy $40 worth of tacos and have a great time there and just pass out. But there's no acute toxicity. Now, I'm not saying that cannabis is all sunshine and rainbows. There are issues with it here and there, but overall, the lies that we've been told about how toxic it is fundamentally not true. And I think the more people understand that you can go out and explore cannabis, because cannabis is not just one active ingredient, too. THC is not the only thing we're talking about. CBD is not the only thing we're talking about here. There's 113 known cannabinoids. The University of British Columbia discovered another 21 about a year ago, and we just learned about THCP and CBDP. So we're always learning about new cannabinoids all the time. And luckily, they don't have this acute toxicity. You can't overdose, so you can go out and explore what works for you. Because a lot of it has to do with the ratios that the different cannabinoids come in and their therapeutic effect, and how they can help you. And each individual person's physiology is different. So what might work for me may not work for you. And so the ability for the patient to understand they can go out exploring and not feel as though they're endangering their lives or becoming addicted to the point where they can't function, those are myths. And as soon as people realize that and they have the ability to kind of open up and explore what cannabis can do for them, I think that's a game changer. I mean, cannabis isn't for everyone, but for those who it is for, I want them to understand that they don't have to be afraid of being a headline the next day and having a very sad family to understand that, to learn that they had overdosed on a drug. That doesn't happen with cannabis.
Yeah, absolutely. And you make a bunch of great points, but I was recently talking to someone, Marie Montmarquette, who's a CEO of a cannabis company, and she pointed out, the average American household has a lethal dose of alcohol within it at any given time. So there's some of this has to do with language, and like you said, just the general messaging that we've heard about this stuff. I think when people hear the words overdose, that they get kind of scared.
Yep.
Like this all lethal dose sounds scary. When alcohol poisoning sounds like something that happens in college, and that's that's part of this knot that needs to be untangled. But there are obviously, like I think both of us would say, things that still need to be understood before we can say that something is 100% safe. It's going to be a full benefit for your life. And there had an interesting moment where kind of worlds collided for me. I'm sure at this point you figured out I listened to the Dr. Drew interview. I found it really interesting because Dr. Drew is somebody that, like, I used to listen to Loveline growing up.
Absolutely.
So
as well.
Yeah. right? Like who doesn't? So
Yeah.
Drew is somebody whose like opinion on cannabis has evolved over time
Yes.
to some degree, but he's a very conservative guy.
Mhm.
And let me actually, as somebody who listened to the show, can I just ask you, like, what was it like to get the opportunity to talk to Drew about drugs?
Well, I mean, Doctor, and I won't say I can't speak to Doctor Drew's true feelings, but from what I gathered from our conversation
Sure.
was exactly what you said. It is evolving and is very much changing. He's
Yeah.
an addiction specialist. That's what he specializes in. And so, you can be addicted to cannabis. It's not the same thing as being addicted to opiates. It's kind of like being addicted to food
Sure.
or exercise or sex or anything like that. You're more addicted to the feeling that occurs from it, as opposed to like a physical addiction like you would have with opiates. And so he's still very much on the side of, he sees what addictions can do to people, but he
Sure.
understands that the medicine itself is profound. And he was very open to having these discussions, and he was fascinated about what the plant does and what it cannot do. And he's an intellectually curious individual. I think most scientists are, most medical doctors are as well. And he only cares about the facts, as do I. Um, Unfortunately for a lot of people, those facts have been twisted and have been completely
Hmm.
ignored for a lot of people, because we've been told for so long that cannabis is bad for us. And so, he was very open to hearing, like, okay, I want to hear what the facts are.
Yeah, exactly. And I do think that in some ways, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like people like Drew, and not necessarily Drew, but people in the medical field, these are kind of the people that you want to be talking to in some ways. Like that openness
Mhm.
is a very positive thing. But I think one thing that was kind of interesting, he did ask you about I think it was a Malcolm Gladwell quote, but he was talking
Mhm.
about sort of this fear that there's like a new tobacco industry on our hands. And I thought your response was great, where you kind of said, people have been consuming cannabis for a long time, and
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that there aren't problems here. But that's the thing that I immediately feel was like, even when it was illegal, there are a lot of people who this was helping.
Yeah.
Um, do you think a lot of people are coming from this perspective that like, they know people smoke, but like they see it as like, oh, we're really going to unleash this like floodgate on society rather than maybe just, I don't know, make it less life altering in a
Hmm.
criminal sense?
Yeah. I mean, the state of cannabis today, as we're recording, and that might be changing relatively soon here. We have a lot of
Right.
people who are incarcerated for owning a plant.
Yep.
And that is,
Yep.
in my opinion, fundamentally offensive to human nature. And
Hmm.
that needs to be absolutely fixed. And so, there's the a lot of people who are putting money and time and efforts towards educating people and understanding that there's still a lot of people who are in jail, and unfortunately here I stand as an individual of privilege, um, and not being jailed, and recognizing that people of color are disproportionately jailed over this particular plant. And that is something that people need to understand, and we need to all come together to try to uh, uh, fix that. Now, to speak about just like opening up the floodgates and letting people decide whether or not cannabis is for them, I think a lot of people would actually be surprised how many people consume cannabis and they're not aware of it. There,
Right.
there are a lot of people who are very high functioning individuals who consume cannabis on a daily basis. Um, and people will be very surprised by that. And cannabis does not
Hmm.
have to be, a lot of the cannabis that we see, people, the stereotypes of people using cannabis, is I think an issue as well. And don't be wrong, I love Cheech and Chong. They're great people. In fact, I'm currently co-authoring Ed Rosenthal's next book with him, and Tommy Chong wrote our foreword.
Oh
I'm a
wow.
huge fan of of that, because I do think that the people who are in the know and do see the jokes that are being presented, they see how ridiculous a lot of people on the other side, how they view the pothead, and I say that with quotation marks. But I don't think people
Hmm.
realize that a lot of potheads, once again with quotation marks, are just your average person just trying to survive in society, and cannabis helps them do that. And cannabis consumption does not have to be getting medicated out of your mind. Although there's nothing, in my opinion, fundamentally wrong with that. I think that's, if you so choose to do that, then that's great. That's fine. As long as you're not harming other individuals, not harming other people. I really typically don't really mind what people do with their lives as long as they're happy. That's great. But a lot of people, you can consume cannabis by taking, microdosing on a daily basis just to feed your endocannabinoid system. You can take cannabis by just taking a small edible, or it's just, hey, when I go home at night, instead of having a glass of wine, I take a little nibble on an edible, or I take a puff on a joint or a vaporizer or a cartridge or anything, and just bring you down a notch. And so you don't have to be the drugged out, and I say this once again with quotation marks, pothead that everyone thinks that cannabis users are, or a lot of people did historically. There are many versions of the cannabis consumer. So I think the fear that, like, oh, once this gets out in the open, everyone's going to be so high and stoned, society's not going to function. I think a lot of people would be truly surprised by the number of people they know in their life that are daily or regular cannabis consumers. And they seem perfectly fine to them. And I think that's one of the stereotypes that need to be broken. And once again, knowledge is power. Science, or no, scientia potentia est, right? That Latin term for knowledge is power is so meaningful to me, because people who understand and know that, yes, you can use cannabis every day and still be a very high functioning individual. Um, when people more and more people understand that, they start to realize that cannabis might be for more people than they think of. And a perfect example is my father-in-law. He and my mother-in-law, unfortunately, are going through a little bit of a hard time, as my father-in-law is dealing with dementia. And
Hmm.
this is an individual who never used cannabis in his life. He went to Berkeley in the '60s, and so maybe one or two times there, but he never used it afterwards. And but now he
Hmm.
uses cannabis all the time, and it helps him sleep at night. It helps my mother-in-law cope with him as well, because he has things that he's dealing with as he's going through this, through dementia, that we can't comprehend what he's going through. But cannabis actually helps him and helps my mother-in-law in so many ways. I think if you were to say, if I were to show someone who is very anti-cannabis my father-in-law and say this man is a daily cannabis consumer, they would be blown away. And I think as we break those
Hmm.
stereotypes more and more, I think more and more people will be open to cannabis.
Well, that's a big reason why I thank you for taking the time to, come on this show and talk about it, because I do think that, not that my show is going to make the difference. It's about splashes in a pond and all of that.
Hmm.
Um, and you made the point that I was basically going to make, which is like, it's I think that the average person, even if they have no interest in using cannabis themselves, have come to a point where they're like, when they hear a story about a guy like the person that we talked about earlier, who, you're basically putting them in a position where they have to choose between not being able to speak and maybe the risk of like lethargy, like some of the side effects that they might experience are not going to be on the same level as dealing with what might be just one symptom of what is going on with them.
Hmm.
And most people will kind of come around when they understand that the other situation is that you're asking that person to break the law just to be able to kind of function. And these are unique situations. It's not everybody, of course, but
Well,
it's powerful stuff.
absolutely. And, just how powerful this plant is. For the longest time, we had people who were choosing to be civilly disobedient just to be able to grow this medicine
Exactly.
for themselves and other people, for cancer patients, people dying from AIDS, from HIV infection, and things along those lines. Cannabis is a very strong therapy for them, and so seeing the compassion of what this plant can provide for people who are suffering is what drove a lot of people to do something that is illegal. Technically, I'm civilly disobedient, and I
Yeah.
don't mind that at all because of the reason why I got into this is, the reason why I started my company was because my mom's cancer diagnosis, and I had done a lot of work in the cannabis industry and done a lot of consulting, and I'd seen what people are putting on those plants, and so they're turning a lot of that medicine to poison. Cannabis is unfortunately very susceptible to fungal infection, so a lot of people use these systemic fungicides that were poisonous, essentially. And I either heard people like, "Oh, what should I use instead?" Because they didn't have access to a lot of cooperative extension that you find in academia. They had to kind of just do it themselves, and they found a product that, hey, it works great. They didn't realize that like myclobutanol, which is a systemic fungicide, when it gets heated up, it releases hydrogen cyanide. And what do you do to
Hmm.
cannabis? You smoke it, you vape it, you cook it. It releases hydrogen cyanide. You don't want that in your lungs. But I also saw a lot of growers. This is previous to regulation in California, who they didn't care that they were doing it. They're just so far removed. So there were two types of growers that I would regularly encounter.
Right.
And the reason why I started my company was because I have this technical training. I have this experience of growing a large scale. And there are going to be other people like my mom who want access to clean cannabis. And my mom, I'm not even joking when I say this. She went to college in the 60s, was invited to a pot party, and she thought she was invited to a Tupperware showing party. So she's very naive when it comes to cannabis. And,
Wow.
my
Yeah.
parents have been married since the early 70s. And
Oh, that's adorable.
seriously, I say that all the time. Like, Mom, you are adorable. Like,
That
it's
is so
ridiculous.
cute.
It's
Yeah.
ridiculous. Exactly. Like, you're so ridiculously cute. And, my parents have been married since the early 70s, and my dad's seen my mom drunk maybe two times. So, like, this is not a woman who inebriates herself. And so
Right.
now she regularly uses cannabis. And my dad's a Vietnam vet and has been coping with some issues with, being a veteran and PTSD. And cannabis has helped him as well. So it's just, not that my parents were ever fundamentally against it, they just never chose it to use it. And I'll just see them using it on a very regular basis. It like, brings joy to my heart to see this plant, something that I'm dedicating my life to, is helping someone as close to me as my parents.
Hmm. Yeah. And I'm really glad that you brought it back around to your own personal story. Excuse me, because it's so true that there's incredible, like, devastating societal impacts from criminalizing
Hmm.
cannabis.
Yeah.
Um, and right now is the time to talk about it, especially with federal legalization, and make sure that we push for as much change there as we possibly can. So I don't mean to gloss over it in any way, but I do think that what's interesting is that, and it's no less important for maybe other reasons, is perhaps in the case of someone like your mom or your dad, because of the association, there, shame can be a very powerful thing, and maybe
Hmm.
something that keeps someone away from trying something that could potentially help them. So I think that's the other reason why these conversations are really helpful. And I know we're just about out of time. I want to get you
Hmm.
back on the road.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, can I mean, I guess the last question would just be, what is most crucially important going forward? What can the average person do to kind of help educate others? Not necessarily being a pain. Is it just sharing these stories? What are good resources or things that you have found are helpful?
That's a great question. For me, now I do think I'm a little bit different than most people just because
Hmm.
of my technical training and the position I do hold in the industry. Um, but for me, podcasts are a very powerful tool for me. Um,
Oh,
I
that's great to hear.
honestly, I learned so much, and an education is never something someone can finish, right? And
Hmm.
I'm always trying to learn new facts about cannabis and understanding what it can and cannot do. And so for me, podcasts have been very powerful. and listening to and reading reports coming off it. I subscribe to a couple subreddits on Reddit.com that
Hmm.
specifically talk about the science of cannabis. Now, my PhD is in plant biology, and so my understanding, I'm fairly scientifically literate, as any PhD would have to be in order to get one. So I can understand different disciplines as well. But my expertise is about whole plant physiology, and what I'm very interested in pursuing, because I think it's virgin territory when it comes to this type of research, is understanding how this crop can grow. And it's all about optimizing the growth of this plant. The reason why I'm interested in that is because knowledge, once again, is power. And as more people understand how this plant is grown and what the plant can do for them on a medical side, more and more people will be entering the marketplace. And being able to grow this crop efficiently, and in horticultural circles, efficiency and sustainability are synonymous. To be able to grow it efficiently, and so when the prices do start dropping, you have more and more cultivators that have been growing, for decades, who are able to glom onto this research that I'm performing and use that research to their benefit to be able to make
Hmm.
their grows more efficient. That's what I'm interested in. That's what I'm excited about. Yes, I'm a cultivator myself. However, at the same time, I do believe the cannabis industry is going to be very much like beer and wine. There's going to be the Bud Lights of the world and the Coors Lights, Michelob Ultras, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's a place for in the marketplace for that. But there's also going to be,
Sure.
Pliny the Elder from Russian River Brewing Company, and things like that. So a little higher ends. There's going to be Lagunitas. There's going to be, I can go to get a bottle of $2 Chuck, or I can go get a bottle of Chateau Montelena. The difference in that is hundreds of dollars. And there's still going to be a marketplace for that to open up. But my goal is to make sure that the boutique growers are able to grow alongside with the big boys and girls who come into the game. That is going to happen, and to think that it's not going to happen is foolish. And I think for people to assume that, but there are ways you can combat that, and I think science and research around the plant and how to grow it properly and efficiently is the way to do that. And one thing I'll always say that is important to me about cannabis, the reason why I designed this hybrid indoor facility, where it's truly an indoor controlled environment agriculture type of facility, but we use the power of the sun, because I'm a huge fan of power of the sun to drive photosynthesis, is the reason why we're growing in this manner is because I want to isolate as many variables as possible so I can do this research to continue on for other generations of cannabis growers. That is very important to me, and it's part of the reason why education is so important to me as well. So people understand that there's more than one way to grow cannabis. There's no one right way. I come across that a lot in the industry as well. People saying like, "Oh, well, the way that I discovered is the right way." Well, it may be right for that person. There's nothing wrong with that, but there are many, many right ways, and I want to open as many doors as possible to make access to cannabis as easy as possible for those who choose to consume it.
Hmm. The last thing I'll just add is
Mm-hmm.
that, especially in this environment where we are, where licenses are limited, I think
Mm-hmm.
that it's important. And, I just appreciate that you're offering people a safer option, that you're giving them a choice to be able to choose, to not, have products like the this is so stupid, but like the system that we're in, competition is going to kind of be the thing that requires that, because right now we don't necessarily have regulation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's important to just call out the people that are, offering that choice.
I fundamentally agree with you. I think competition is not a bad thing, but in competition you want to have a level playing field. That isn't always the case, and so I'm always interested in trying to find ways we have a level playing field for everyone to play on. I mean, maybe that's just the competitor in me,
Yeah.
but there's nothing wrong with winning, but as long as you won by fair rules that are set up, and right now those rules and laws are not fair. So that does definitely needs to change. But the part that I do on my side is I can help um, with some of that research, and working with some of the universities. I work with my alma mater, UC Davis, and their and advise on a light side role of kind of a lighter side of their Cannabis and Hemp Research Center that just recently launched. And I think it's through that type of gaining of knowledge around this plant will equal the playing field for more people. Now, I'm not a regulatory guru. I'm not a politics person. I'm a scientist, and
Sure.
so this is the way I can contribute, and that's the way I want to.
Sure.
Yeah.
Rob Flannery is the CEO and founder of Dr. Rob Farms. Dr. Rob, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I could talk to you for a whole lot longer.
The feeling is absolutely mutual. I feel like we could have gone for another hour or two.
Yep.
But I sincerely appreciate your time as well. The feeling is absolutely mutual.
Same. All right, let's get you back on the road. You can find more cannabis industry reporting at trichomes.com, as well as more great shows like this one. If you're a member of the cannabis community and you have a story you want to share with us, reach out. You can reach the show at highground@trichomes.com. Please take a second to subscribe to the podcast and write a review. It really helps others find the show. You can also join the discussion with industry insiders and get your voice heard by joining the community at trichomes.com and following us on all social media. The show is produced by David Fortin. I'm Jesse Batend, and thank you for listening.